In a world ruled by fear and fire, the banished witches were more than myth. They were rebels, healers, and keepers of forbidden knowledge. This hidden history has been buried beneath centuries of lies, where the occult wasn't evil. It was empowering. Today, we uncover the truth behind the exiled women who defied religious dogma and patriarchal rule. From secret rituals to coded grimoires, their legacy of resistance still echoes in the shadows. Welcome to Banished Witches, the hidden history of occult rebellion, a journey into the forgotten magic that once threatened empires and still haunts the halls of power. Let's begin. Banished Witches, the hidden history of occult rebellion. Throughout history, the term witch has evoked fear, mystery, and condemnation. The word conjures images of broomsticks, bubbling cauldrons, and malevolent spells. But behind the myth and stereotype lies a far more complex and hidden history, one that centers around rebellion, empowerment, and resistance. The witch trials of Europe and America were not merely about superstition. They were tools of social control that suppressed dissent, marginalized women, and extinguished indigenous spiritual practices. At the heart of this history are the banished witches, individuals who stood in opposition to societal norms and paid a grave price. This essay explores the hidden history of these occult rebels, examining their social, political, and spiritual significance. It reveals how witches, far from being evil, were often midwives, healers, and spiritual leaders, and how their persecution was a calculated effort to dismantle ancient wisdom and community autonomy. 1. The origins of the witch figure. The word witch is rooted in the Old English terms Wicca, male sorcerer, and Wicce, female sorceress, which are believed to stem from Wic, meaning to bend or shape. Before it became a pejorative, being called a witch often implied a deep connection to the natural world, to herbs, healing, and to unseen forces. In pre-Christian Europe, societies were largely animistic and polytheistic. Women, and sometimes men, who acted as intermediaries between the spirit world and the physical realm held positions of power. These people conducted fertility rites, predicted the future, healed the sick, and ensured bountiful harvests. Far from being feared, they were respected for their knowledge of the land and of the body. However, as Christianity spread across Europe from the 4th century onward, pagan practices were increasingly demonized. The Christian Church sought to centralize spiritual authority, and anything that could not be absorbed into its doctrine was labeled heretical. Women who had once been seen as priestesses or shamans became witches, a term now laden with sin and Satanism. 2. The witch hunts, political power, and gender control. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, tens of thousands of people, most of them women, were executed as witches. While religious fear of the devil was a significant driver of these witch hunts, deeper motivations lay beneath the surface. Witch hunts were often political tools used to maintain control over shifting populations and growing unrest. Women as targets. Roughly 75 to 85% of those accused of witchcraft were women, particularly those who were elderly, widowed, unmarried, or otherwise socially marginal. In patriarchal societies where female autonomy was deeply feared, a woman who lived independently, who healed without clerical approval, or who challenged authority could easily become a target. The famous Malleus Maleficarum, 1487, written by Inquisitor Heinrich Kramer, explicitly argued that women were more likely to be witches due to their supposed susceptibility to temptation and sin. This weaponization of gender worked in tandem with economic and political instability. In times of plague, famine, or war, scapegoats were needed, and witches filled the role perfectly. The role of the state and church. Witchcraft trials were a collaboration between religious institutions and secular authorities. Accusations were encouraged, confessions extracted under torture, and executions carried out publicly. Far from being random, these actions followed a systematic campaign to eliminate perceived threats to the dominant power structure. By criminalizing the occult, the state not only marginalized spiritual practices outside Christianity, but also created an atmosphere of paranoia. Neighbors turned against each other, women distrusted women, and communities became fractured. This environment made organized resistance nearly impossible, and social cohesion broke down. 3. Occult knowledge as resistance. In the modern era, the occult is often associated with fringe belief systems, but during the time of the witch trials, it represented a vast body of hidden knowledge. Herbalism, astrology, alchemy, and divination were not just magical curiosities. They were serious systems of thought, often passed down orally through generations. The healers and herbalists. Many accused witches were skilled in the medicinal use of plants. These healers were invaluable in rural areas where access to doctors was limited or non-existent. Their knowledge of herbalism, based on centuries of trial, error, and intuition, posed a challenge to the emerging professional medical class, which was dominated by men and sanctioned by the church. When a herbalist could heal a sick child that the village priest had failed to cure, it threatened the religious and medical orthodoxy. The suppression of these healers was not merely religious, it was a form of professional gatekeeping. Magic and autonomy. To practice magic was, in many ways, an act of autonomy. It suggested that individuals could tap into forces beyond the control of church or state. Whether it was casting protection spells, reading omens, or communing with spirits, these acts offered people, especially women, a sense of agency in a world where they often had none. This made magic inherently rebellious. It represented a parallel system of belief and empowerment that bypassed traditional authority. Those who practiced it were not merely spiritual outsiders, they were political dissidents cloaked in superstition. 4. Colonialism, witchcraft, and cultural erasure. The witch hunts were not confined to Europe. As colonial powers expanded into Africa, the Americas, and Asia, they brought with them the same demonization of indigenous spiritual practices. The Inquisition and the New World. In the Americas, colonial missionaries and settlers encountered complex spiritual systems involving shamanism, ancestor worship, and animism. These practices were quickly labeled demonic. The Spanish Inquisition extended its reach to the New World, burning native texts, destroying temples, and executing those who resisted conversion. Many indigenous healers and spiritual leaders, like the Nahuatl healers or the Andean curanderos, were rebranded as witches. In doing so, colonial powers equated rebellion against Christian rule with allegiance to evil. Spiritual rebellion was met with brutal punishment. The African diaspora and syncretic religions. Enslaved Africans brought their own spiritual traditions to the Americas, including Vodou, Santeria, and Hoodoo. These systems combined African deities, Catholic saints, and indigenous spirits in syncretic rituals that defied colonial rule. Practitioners were often accused of witchcraft and brutally punished. Yet these practices persisted, becoming acts of cultural preservation and resistance. In a society that stripped people of language, heritage, and family, occult rituals allowed them to retain a sense of identity and power. These banished witches were not merely rebels, they were keepers of ancestral wisdom. 5. The revival of the witch archetype. The 20th and 21st centuries have seen a dramatic resurgence of interest in witchcraft, particularly in feminist and countercultural movements. The image of the witch has been reclaimed not as a figure of evil, but as a symbol of resistance and feminine power. The rise of neo-paganism. Movements like Wicca, founded in the 1950s by Gerald Gardner, sought to revive ancient pagan traditions and reframe witchcraft as a nature-based spiritual path. While heavily influenced by modern ideas, Wicca and other neo-pagan systems acknowledged their connection to persecuted traditions and sought to reclaim the wisdom of the banished. Many neo-pagan covens center on female empowerment, environmentalism, and community healing. They reject hierarchical religious structures and emphasize direct experience of the divine. Feminism and the witch. Feminist movements of the 1960s and 70s embraced the witch as a figure of defiance. Books like The Spiral Dance by Starhawk and Witches, Midwives, and Nurses by Barbara Ehrenreich and Deirdre English reframed the witch trials as a form of gendered violence and historical silencing. Today, the hashtag Witchesif Instagram and the explosion of interest in tarot, astrology, and crystals reflect a broader desire for alternative spirituality. For many, practicing witchcraft is not just about belief, it is about reclaiming control in a chaotic world. From persecution to empowerment. The history of witches is a history of rebellion against religious dogma, patriarchal authority, colonial power, and intellectual suppression. The banished witches of history were not the evil figures of myth, but the outcasts, healers, rebels, and visionaries who dared to live differently. By understanding their stories, we gain more than historical insight. We reconnect with a tradition of resistance that continues to inspire. In an age still grappling with control over women's bodies, the erasure of indigenous cultures, and the commodification of spirituality, the witch hunts, fear, power, and the anatomy of a persecution. From the late Middle Ages through the early modern period, Europe and colonial America were gripped by an obsessive fear of witchcraft. This fear led to what is now known as the witch hunts, a violent and systematic campaign that lasted from roughly the 15th to the 18th century. Tens of thousands of people, the vast majority of them women, were accused, tortured, and executed under the charge of practicing witchcraft. Today, these events are often dismissed as episodes of mass hysteria, but a closer examination reveals a deeper and more disturbing truth. The witch hunts were not simply about superstition or religious zeal. They were about power, religious, political, and patriarchal. They functioned as mechanisms of social control, tools to suppress dissent, and instruments for reinforcing rigid hierarchies. This essay explores the historical context, causes, processes, and consequences of the witch hunts in 1,800 words, shedding light on one of the darkest chapters in Western history. 1. The historical roots of witchcraft beliefs. Belief in witches predates the Christian era. In ancient societies, figures who could supposedly control the elements, spirits, or fate were often seen as shamans, wise women, or seers. These individuals were sometimes feared, but they were also respected and even revered. Their knowledge of herbs, healing, and spiritual practices formed an important part of community life. As Christianity spread across Europe, it encountered these older belief systems and gradually reinterpreted them. Pagan gods became demons, and magic, once seen as sacred, was rebranded as sinful and satanic. This religious recoding laid the foundation for the later demonization of witches. 2. The rise of witch hunts in the 15th century. The systematic persecution of witches did not begin until the late 1400s. The turning point came with the publication of Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches, in 1487 by Heinrich Kramer, a German inquisitor. This infamous manual offered a framework for identifying, interrogating, and prosecuting witches. It painted witchcraft as a dire and growing threat to Christian society and emphasized the role of women as the primary culprits. Several factors contributed to the rise of the witch hunts. A. Religious turmoil. The Protestant Reformation 1517 and the Catholic Counter-Reformation created deep rifts in Europe. Each side accused the other of heresy and corruption. In this climate of fear and moral panic, witchcraft became an easy scapegoat for natural disasters, disease, and societal breakdown. B. Political instability. Europe in the early modern period was plagued by wars, famines, and plagues. In times of crisis, rulers and church leaders often redirected public fear and anger toward witches, offering them as explanations for suffering. See legal changes. The introduction of inquisitorial procedures meant that trials could begin based on suspicion alone. Torture was widely used to extract confessions, and hearsay was admissible as evidence. This created a judicial environment ripe for abuse. 3. The targets of the witch hunts. A. Women and misogyny. Roughly 75 to 85% of the people executed as witches were women. This overwhelming gender disparity is not accidental. The witch hunts were deeply rooted in misogyny. Women, particularly those who were elderly, widowed, unmarried, or poor, were seen as more susceptible to the devil's influence. The Malleus Maleficarum argued that women were inherently weak-willed, more emotional, and sexually insatiable, all traits, it claimed, that made them ideal witches. Midwives, herbalists, and healers, women with specialized knowledge, were especially vulnerable. In a patriarchal society, a woman with knowledge and autonomy was a threat. By branding her a witch, society could punish her for stepping outside her assigned role. Be outsiders and the marginalized. While women were the primary targets, others were not immune. People with disabilities, mental illness, or eccentric behavior could easily be accused. So could foreigners, the poor, and those who held unpopular opinions. The witch hunts functioned as a purge of the other, a way to enforce conformity and suppress deviance. 4. The mechanics of a witch trial. Once accused, the path to execution was almost inevitable. The trial process was heavily biased and designed to produce confessions. Accusation and arrest. Accusations could stem from personal vendettas, neighborly disputes, or mere suspicion. In some cases, children were used as witnesses. In communities where tensions simmered just below the surface, a single accusation could trigger a chain reaction of arrests. Interrogation and torture. The accused were often tortured until they confessed. Common methods included the strap pato, suspension by the arms, thumbscrews, and sleep deprivation. Confessions were frequently embellished to fit prevailing narratives: meetings with the devil, attendance at Sabbaths, flying through the night, or engaging in sexual orgies with demons. Execution. If convicted, the accused were typically hanged or burned at the stake. In some regions, they were strangled before being burned. In others, they were burned alive. These executions were often public spectacles meant to serve as warnings to others. 5. The witch hunts across Europe and America. Germany and Switzerland. The Holy Roman Empire saw some of the most brutal witch hunts. Entire villages were purged. In Würzburg and Bamberg, mass trials led to the execution of hundreds. Germany's fragmented political structure allowed local leaders to carry out their own inquisitions with little oversight. Scotland and England. Scotland had one of the highest per capita execution rates. King James VI, later James I of England, was obsessed with witchcraft and even wrote a book on the subject, Demonology. England, though slightly more restrained, still saw thousands of accusations and hundreds of executions. France and Spain. Inquisitions in these countries were more controlled by the church and often more skeptical of witchcraft claims. However, localized outbreaks, such as the Loudun possessions in France, still occurred. Colonial America. The Salem witch trials 1692–93 in Massachusetts are the most famous American example. In just over a year, 200 people were accused and 20 were executed. The trials were driven by religious extremism, local rivalries, and adolescent hysteria, but they followed the same basic pattern seen across Europe. 6. The decline of the witch hunts. By the early 18th century, the witch hunts had largely subsided. Several factors contributed to their decline. A rise of rationalism. The Enlightenment brought a new emphasis on reason, evidence, and scientific inquiry. Philosophers and scientists began to question the validity of witch trials. Prominent figures like Baruch Spinoza, Voltaire, and others criticized the hunts as barbaric and irrational. Legal reforms. Torture fell out of favor in many countries, and legal standards for evidence improved. Courts began to demand tangible proof rather than spectral evidence or confessions extracted under duress. Concerns. 7. The legacy of the witch hunts. The witch hunts left deep scars on Western culture. Tens of thousands of people died, and countless others lived in fear. Communities were torn apart, and traditional knowledge was lost. A. Cultural memory. The image of the witch persists in folklore, literature, and popular culture. While once a symbol of evil, the witch has increasingly been reclaimed as a figure of resistance, femininity, and empowerment. B. Feminist perspectives. Modern feminist scholars view the witch hunts as a form of gendered violence, an attempt to silence women and eliminate their influence. Texts like Witches, Midwives, and Nurses by Ehrenreich and English argue that the persecution of witches was also the persecution of early female medical practitioners. See historical lessons. The witch hunts serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of moral panic, scapegoating, and unchecked authority. They remind us how fear can be weaponized and how legal systems can become instruments of terror. 8. Modern witch hunts. The continuation of a pattern. Though the witch hunts of early modern Europe are over, similar dynamics continue in different forms. A. Witch accusations in Africa and Asia. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa, India, and Papua New Guinea, people, especially women, are still accused of witchcraft and attacked. These accusations often arise in contexts of poverty, illness, or social tension. B. Political and ideological witch hunts. The term witch hunt is now used metaphorically to describe political purges, smear campaigns, and ideological crackdowns. The same patterns of fear-mongering, scapegoating, and moral righteousness are evident. From persecution to understanding. The witch hunts were not merely episodes of irrational fear. They were calculated campaigns rooted in religious extremism, social control, and patriarchal dominance. Understanding this history is vital, not only to honor the memory of those who suffered but to recognize how similar mechanisms of persecution persist today. In reclaiming the stories of those labeled witches, we challenge the systems that silence them. We affirm the importance of reason, justice, and the courage to resist tyranny. The stories of the banished witches aren't just history. They're warnings and whispers from a past that refuses to stay silent. Their rebellion, cloaked in shadow and flame, was a fight for wisdom, power, and freedom. As we unearth these forgotten truths, we reclaim a legacy that still challenges the systems built to silence it. If their voices stirred something within you, like, subscribe, and join us as we continue to explore the hidden corners of history. Darkness isn't always evil. Sometimes it's where the light begins. This was Banished Witches, the hidden history of occult rebellion. Until next time.